April 16th, 1945. The population of Berlin woke up in complete turmoil after hearing the thunderous Soviet artillery in the distance. Despite the fact that Soviet forces were still about 60 kilometers from Berlin, no alarms had been raised, nor had there been any official announcement about the enemy attack on the Oder River. However, even without any formal notice, Berliners knew perfectly well that the great Soviet offensive against their city had begun. During these first days, due to the lack of accurate information from the government, rumors and false reports of all kinds spread throughout the capital. It is important to remember that since the end of January that same year, thousands of refugees had begun arriving in the city, fleeing from territories east of the Oder. These refugees carried terrifying news about what Red Army soldiers were doing to the civilian population. Later, we will see how German teenage girls reacted to such horrifying news. In any case, the rumors circulating from April 16th onwards mainly concerned the Soviet positions. Some said that the vanguard of the Red Army was already just 15 kilometers from Berlin, while others claimed that the enemy had reached the eastern districts of the city. Nonetheless, the truth was that no one really knew what was happening, but it was clear that the city's days were numbered. The main question on everyone's mind was how the end would come, and whether they would survive it. Most men aged between 14 and 65 had been mobilized to fight within the militia unit known as the Volkssturm, organized into two waves. Wave 1 included men born between 1884 and 1924, with an average age of 52 years. They were veterans with some training and equipment. Wave 2 consisted of men of the same age range who were performing essential civilian work and would only be equipped and sent to the front lines if fighting reached the city itself. In total, about 40 battalions were formed, 20 per wave, with an estimated strength of 40,000 to 60,000 men, although their real effectiveness and combat readiness were very limited. During the final months of the war, the presence of the so-called Seydlitz troops, former German POWs recruited by the Soviets to infiltrate their old comrades, created a climate of distrust and confusion in the German rear lines. These agents were used to spread disinformation, sabotage operations, and destabilize units from within, which led the German High Command to issue urgent orders for heightened vigilance even among German military and civilian units. Paranoia spread among the ranks, where any unknown soldier could be seen as a potential infiltrated traitor, causing great confusion within the city. Little by little, graffiti began appearing on the walls of buildings reading, "Berlin will remain German, victory or slavery, and in some cases, he who believes in Hitler believes in victory." In the face of such uncertainty, and while waiting for official news, people tried to hide their anguish and continue to live their daily lives. Berliners still went shopping, even knowing that their money would soon be worthless. They also tried to stockpile as much food as possible before the fighting reached the capital. Meanwhile, Tempelhof Airport, located south of Berlin, continued normal operations with its last civilian flight departing on April 23rd, while Soviet forces were completing the encirclement of the city. At the end of this program, we will reveal where that last flight went and what happened to it. As for entertainment, there was little to be found. Most bars, theaters, and cinemas were closed. However, the few cinemas that remained open, like the one in Charlottenburg, saw a great influx of people. In the end, all many Berliners wanted was to escape from reality. One of the films most frequently shown was Kohlberg, which, despite having premiered on January 30th, 1945, was screened again in all the cinemas that were still open during this month of April. The reason, as is evident, was that the film tells the story of the heroic defense of the city of Kohlberg during the Napoleonic Wars. It mattered little that, in reality, the city eventually surrendered to the French, because in the 1945 German version, the Prussian city of Kohlberg held firm in its resistance and forced the French to retreat. That was the message they wanted to convey to the German people. The firm belief that if they could organize a fierce resistance and inflict heavy casualties on their enemies, the latter would have no choice but to stop attacking and withdraw. According to testimonies from that time, the film motivated many soldiers and even civilians who became deeply emotional while watching it and longed to become the heroes they saw on screen. This phenomenon can still be observed today, as many similar so-called recruitment films continue to be produced. Another issue that deserves attention is the operation of businesses and industrial plants located in or near Berlin. Strange as it may seem, and despite the city having endured heavy Allied bombing for many months, the vast majority of factories continued to operate at full capacity. German workers had to juggle their factory shifts with building defenses within the city, on top of the time they needed to devote to military training for the imminent combat. With the loss of the Ruhr Valley and Silesia, these were among the last factories left to Germany. Due to the urgent situation and the severe shortage of materials and ammunition at the front, everything produced in these factories was immediately dispatched to the combat zones upon completion. Whether it was bullets, rifles, machine guns, grenades, or new tanks, everything was rushed to the final German defensive lines along the Oder River. The situation was so desperate that due to the shortage of military personnel, many companies had to send their own workers as drivers to deliver supplies to the front. However, many civilians refused to go, knowing that in many cases, it would mean certain death. As for other services aside from industry such as radio broadcasts, weather forecasting, or postal services, they continued to function almost normally until a few days later, when the battle within the city itself began. One question that naturally arises is whether, given the looming threat over the capital, many Berliners chose to flee the city or decided to stay. It must be noted that by April 1945, many Berliners had already left the city to escape the bombings, just as had happened in most major cities. However, it is estimated that the population at the beginning of the year was still over 2.5 million people. For instance, Albert Speer offered help to evacuate many musicians from the Berlin Philharmonic. Yet, contrary to what common sense might suggest, the majority of them, whose last concert took place on April 12th, chose to remain in the capital. A vote was held among them to decide whether to accept the safe transport Speer offered to leave Berlin, but the offer was rejected. In the end, many of them had relatives in the city and strong emotional ties to Berlin, leading them to stay. Finally, we come to the topic of the so-called Fortress Berlin. As we have analyzed in previous programs, Berlin's defenses had begun to be prepared at a very late stage, and although efforts were intensified during April, they were far from effective enough to stop the Red Army. The main roads and highways remained open, there were few cannons and armored vehicles available, and the only armed men visible defending the city were old police officers, members of the Volkssturm, and teenage boys and children from the Hitler Youth. The near-total absence of real soldiers foreshadowed that the battle for the city would not last long. A series of makeshift defenses began to appear across the capital. All official buildings were protected with sandbags. The rubble from what had once been large apartment blocks just months before was now piled up to block streets. Similarly, trams and vehicles that had been put out of service were filled with debris and positioned as barricades in the streets. These were the defenses intended to stop the Soviet assault on Berlin. However, many wondered whether, as the war propaganda claimed, these barricades would truly be enough to halt the enemy. Among the population, a joke began to circulate that went as follows. The Russians will take about 2 hours and 15 minutes to break through these fortifications, 15 minutes to cross them, and 2 hours laughing at them. And so, little by little, the situation worsened as the German defenses along the Oder River began to collapse, and reports that the Soviets were getting closer to the capital started to arrive. In Berlin, an alert system was installed to warn of a surprise Soviet armored breakthrough. The code word to activate the alert system was Clausewitz. April 20th marked Hitler's last birthday. He woke up at 10 a.m. and received birthday greetings from the Americans, who carried out a midday bombing raid with nearly 300 B-17 bombers. When he received his morning briefing, he was informed that the code word Clausewitz had been issued at 4 o'clock that morning, meaning that Soviet forces were entering the city. From that moment, with Soviet troops entering Berlin's outskirts, German propaganda focused on two main messages. First, it was claimed that a large German army was rushing towards Berlin to save the situation. Second, if that failed, it was believed that the Americans and British would intervene to prevent the Red Army from capturing the city. As strange as both ideas may seem today, numerous studies show that this is indeed what many Berliners believed at the time. Clinging to this hope helped them endure day-to-day life, which was quickly turning into a nightmare. Now, lastly, let's talk about the final civilian flight that took off from Tempelhof Airport. On April 21, 1945, German civil aviation operated its last scheduled flights, and in the following days, additional unscheduled flights made stops at Tempelhof to load material and documents bound for Munich. 2 days later, on April 23rd, the last flight operated by the airline departed from Tempelhof, heading toward Madrid, but it was shot down over southern Germany. Shortly after, Tempelhof's German commander, Colonel Rudolf Böttger, refused to follow orders to demolish the airport. Soviet forces captured Tempelhof during the final days of the Battle of Berlin on April 28 and 29, 1945. The Soviets thoroughly searched both the old and new terminals, looking for hidden treasures, caches, and documents, opening every room they encountered. Finally, how did young German teenage girls react to the news that they would likely be assaulted by Red Army soldiers? As one might imagine, there was total panic among Berlin's population. Knowing what would happen once Soviet soldiers entered Berlin, many young women chose to try to become pregnant by any German man they could find, in hopes of avoiding the horrors that awaited them at the hands of the enemy.